All right, we're on to part 3 now. If you missed part 1 and 2, there'll be some links in the description and at the end of this video. And what we have now is our basic lure body shape, half of it because we're being efficient. And now what we're gonna do is work on the internal weighting and the cavities where you might wanna put rattles or weights or things like that. And then the alignment on how we put the lure halves together once we print them. Now, if you watched any of my other videos, you've seen me make complete lures that I printed in one piece, and you can throw your rattles and your stuff inside the eyes, basically, and get them into the cavity. I'm not gonna do that in this video, simply because there's a lot more complications to that. I wanna do it the more traditional way with 2 halves, with some slight tweaks that we make for specifically 3D printing these halves that you might not have seen before. Let's go. All right guys, so here's our twitch bait shape. I've messed around with it just a little bit, adjusting the curve, things like that, but it's pretty close to where we left off in the last video. What we're gonna do is break it into pieces first, and I do this to make it easier to kind of visualize the lure as it comes together and to hollow out certain sections. Just to be clear, I wanna show you, if you wanna hollow out this whole section, we can just click on the shell tool, click on this face, and then we give it a number, which is basically the thickness of the shell. So let's just say 1.5 millimeters. It'll crunch for a while, and then I'll have a 1.5 millimeter edge all the way around, and I'll be completely hollow. So that's great if you're doing something like a topwater bait, you know, like a popper, and you just need it to float. Now, one thing, if you just make it hollow like this though, is it's gonna be the same buoyancy all around, and it might not sit right. It has a tendency to roll. So let's correct that. All right, I'm just gonna cancel out of that because that's not what we wanna do. I just wanna show you that bit. So in general, when you talk about a lure, the back of the lure and the front of the lure tend to be solid, or at least more solid. And this is where we're gonna take advantage of some of the processes involved in 3D printing to give us a leg up over more traditional lure building techniques. So what I'm gonna do is just create a sketch on this plane. I could even create on that face if I wanted to. And I'm just gonna draw a line, and this basically, I'm just gonna divide up the lure with these lines. Okay, and I'm actually gonna throw in an eye real quick. I'm just gonna make it a 8 millimeter circle. You know, this will be kind of the size, whatever size you want it to be. Actually, no, I want it to be 10. And I do that for a couple of different reasons. One is it gives me an idea of where this eye will sit if I do end up wanting to make it a lure that is completely printed in one piece instead of 2. And it gives me an idea of where in relationship to the hollow part and the solid part I'm gonna be. Now, I accidentally put a constraint on there, so I'm gonna delete that real quick. I want this eye to sit only in the solid part of the lure. So if you haven't figured out yet, I'm gonna cut this body into parts, leave this one solid, leave this one solid, and kind of hollow out this middle part to give me my buoyancy. Now there's a lot of ways you can do buoyancy in a lure, but I'm gonna try to make it to where we don't really need to add any additional weight to have this lure act the way we want in the water, at least floating wise. All right, so I got these 2 bits in place. I think that makes sense. You know, this is about 20 millimeters. Maybe we'll just stick it at 20 millimeters right there. And then I want to make one more line here, and I'm actually going to make this a spline. And I'm just going to kind of connect that to here. All right, hit the escape key, kind of move this up, and maybe put a little bit of a bend in it. Okay, so now I basically laid out with these lines the parts that are solid and the parts that are going to be hollow. Solid, 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 and hollow. So now what I do is I finish sketch, and I'm actually going to split this body up. Split body, boom, splitting tools. And I can use 2 splitting tools here because they're both going the same way, right? And we'll scroll up there. You can extend splitting tools, that's fine. And we're going to split this lure like that. Okay, so now I have 3 bodies over here if we paw that down. So I'm gonna actually just turn off that one, that's the tail, and turn off that one, that's the head. And let's bring back our other sketch that we have here. If I can click today, clicking is fun. All right, now we're just gonna split this body again. Click split body, there. Splitting tool is this line right here. You can rotate and see that. Click OK. So now we have these 2 bodies here. We have a top and a bottom. Let's turn off the bottom because we want to leave that one solid, and we can turn off our sketch now. So now I have this little sliver of the lure, and now I can actually use the shell command. Click shell, click this face, and let's just say 1.5. Now, actually, Fusion is terrible at shelling things. It'll frequently mess up, so sometimes you have to just get all kinds of wacky with this. What happens is, in the corners here, if it gets too thick, Fusion does not like to wrap them and kind of fill it in, if you will. So if I made this like 6, it's probably gonna start complaining, yeah. So it can't handle the computation there. So just if you get errors, if you run into problems, just know usually you need to just make that number smaller. And sometimes it's, you know, the smallest of increments. I guess I'll make this one 2. That's fine. Now you can't select multiple faces and bodies, so it's only going to hollow out 1 on the inside, and that's fine. So let's click OK, and that's going to make that. So now if I bring back my bodies real quick, just to give you a visualization, you know, what I've done is I've basically made an air cavity up top here. And, you know, you can put your rattles in there, you can put whatever you want to. And it's also obviously going to provide buoyancy on the lure. Now, all of this stuff is going to be solid resin and it'll be significantly heavier. What I don't know is if it's going to be heavy enough, right? And that's really, you know, you got to do some math. I usually print a few, see what happens, you know, make sure when you're testing them, you add whatever rattles in there. If you're using steel rattles, steel BBs, steel ball bearings, it's obviously going to add weight, where if you're using plastic, it's not going to add weight, et cetera, et cetera. This is very much a trial and error process for me, at least right now, to figure out how much of an air gap I need there. Now, if you're printing it solid, you know, obviously, you know, you're golden, you just print it and away you go. So if you look at most commercial lures, you'll see that they have a lot of different chambers in there, and you can do the same thing here using the same technique that we just did. So let's say I want to put like a little cavity in the belly here, just a small one. I can go back in here and create a sketch. If I know it ahead of time, I would have created this ahead of time, but you know, I'm just showing you now. And I'm just gonna make this one a rectangle for expeditious sake. That's not even a word, bro. That body, select that as my splitting tool, and we're gonna split it up there, click OK, and again, same process. Get rid of these. You don't even have to get rid of these bodies if you don't want to. I can just shell that 1.5, boom. All right, now I have a little hollow body in there, and I can just join these all back together, right? So I click this, click combine, it's a target body, I go to tool bodies, boom, boom, and click join. I don't want to keep tools, click OK. So now I have a little cavity in there. And you know, you can play around with those numbers, 1 millimeter versus 1.5 versus 2, like whatever, man. And you can come back and do the same thing with the top, right? We're gonna fuse all these together. But before we do that, I want to show you one little trick that's kind of an ugly hack, but if you, it comes in handy if you want to use it. So when we're hollowing this stuff out, you know, we're primarily concerned about the thickness of this top ridge here. And so if you get down to a point where, you know, you want to remove some material, some additional material, the easiest way I've found to do it is to extrude these internal faces. Again, it's kind of an ugly hack, but it works pretty well. So let's say I want to remove these in cap pieces here, right? And now this only works on straight faces. I can't extrude this face, for example, and I have to run some more hacks, but it'll work on these flat faces here. So let me blow these out here real quick. So I click this face, like boom, run it through, cut OK, and I click here, extrude, run it through the back, click OK. So that just removes a little more material if you need to open up this section to maybe another section that you have, right? And so you can go through and you can cut stuff out. Like I can't cut this out because it's not flat, but you could, you know, you could do some hacks there with the extrude command. And then we come back through and we put everything back together. So I like to start with whatever body it ended up keeping that name and click combine, select all of these other parts. I'm just holding down the shift key there, join, and boom. And there we go. You can see, you know, that extrusion gets a little weird. It doesn't follow the path, but you know, hey, you do you, bro. So a quick side note here, these belly cavities kind of support rattles that will just go side to side very quickly as the lure is wiggling side to side, whereas the longer cavities up top really support when you jerk the bait, the rattles or the balls or whatever you have in there will slam back and forth and make a lot more noise. So that's the kind of reason for those two different cavities. Now, since we're gonna do two halves, we're gonna wanna glue them together and we're gonna want some alignment pins. And what I've seen a lot of people do is they come in and they make a pin that's round, they stick it to one side and then put the hole in the other side. And I find that doesn't really work well. So I'm gonna show you the process that I use that I think works the best. So to start off with, we're gonna just kind of decide where we want our alignment pins to be. Now I know in this lure, right, I'm gonna have a screw eye here in the front, a screw eye in the back, and probably a screw eye in the bottom, maybe right here for my hooks. I actually probably put that cavity in a stupid place, but we're gonna put a screw eye right here. So I wanna kind of avoid those areas. So I'm thinking maybe right here would be a good spot for an alignment pin. Gonna have my eye up here somewhere too. If we turn that sketch back on, right? My eye is gonna be there. Shouldn't really impact the alignment at all, but you know, if I can help it, I just wanna avoid that area. So let's do one here, one kind of in this belly area up close to the top, and one kind of in this front area. I'm also gonna have this is a twitch bait, so I'm not gonna have a lip here, but if you had a lure with a lip, you know, you kind of wanna avoid that area as well. And you don't necessarily have to do these alignment pins now. You could wait until you did a lip. I'm gonna have a whole video on making crankbait lips and incorporating them into your lure bodies coming up soon. I've made some really cool discoveries in that area for 3D printing, but today we're keeping it simple with a twitch bait, so I'm gonna put a pin right here. Okay, so what we wanna do now, let's turn that sketch off, create a new sketch. I'm gonna create it right on this face. And what I'm gonna use is actually polygons, circumscribed polygons. And we're gonna end up 3D printing these, so the bigger the better, actually. 2.5 is probably good. All right, so we got a 2.5. We'll go ahead and create another one here, polygon circumscribed. So we want to keep them all the same size, and that will just make it easier when I go to assemble the lure if they're all the same exact size. This would be a good use for a parameter. Once you decide how big you want your, what is that, hexagon, circumscribed polygon to be, kind of in all your lure builds, it's a great thing to put into a parameter so you don't have to remember these numbers going forward. And then you can actually print out a bunch of these pins in one shot and not have to print them each time you want to print a lure. So let's see, can we fit a 3.5 in there? Yeah, all right. Can we make this one a 3.5? Ooh, that's cutting it pretty close. Then I'm going to, just for giggles, we're gonna make that one horizontal, vertical there. And let's create another circumscribed polygon up here in the front, 3.5, boom, and make it horizontal, vertical here. Hit the escape key, and now we can kind of move these around and see. That looks pretty good. Move this guy down. So in case you haven't figured out yet, we're gonna extrude these out and we're gonna cut holes in the lure body itself for alignment pins, in this case, hexagonal shape alignment pins. So I need to kind of avoid areas where I have my voids. Avoid the voids, bro. Okay. So we can finish this sketch. Now I want to extrude. I'm going to select all of these guys. I'm going to say symmetric, and all right, we can kind of eyeball the distance here. You know, probably, see, that back one is tricky. Let's just make a 2.5. Now the smaller I make these things in circumference and depth, like the harder they are to kind of deal with alignment wise, but they generally need to be kind of small. I already have them fairly large there on the diameter at 3.5, so I think we'll be okay. Now, the key here is I want to do a new body. I don't want to cut these just yet, and I'll show you why. So we click OK. All right, so there we go. Now, the cool thing about hexagons instead of circles is that circles, when you put a lure together, right, you can still turn it and twist it. With a hexagon, they're gonna slide right in there and lock into place, and you're not gonna have any potential for twisting. Now, the downside is that if you have any kind of variations in your printing or anything like that, it can make alignment and fitting them difficult, but we're gonna compensate for that, and I'll show you how. At 51, I compensate for a lot of stuff, so I know about compensation. Okay, so now what we're gonna do is we're going to combine these together. So here's my target body, the big guy. My tool bodies are all these. Now the important thing here is we wanna keep tools and we wanna cut. So that's gonna cut my little holes out and it's gonna keep my pins. I need to keep those around right now because I've never printed them before. In the future, right, if you have a bunch, you don't need to necessarily keep these around. And we click OK. All right, so now let's hide our body. Let's rename these pins. Now again, these are all the same, so I'm not gonna need to export and print all of these. I'm just kind of naming them so I know what I'm dealing with. Okay, so now we're gonna come in and we're going to click these back faces and these front faces, and we're going to hit the F key for fillet, or fillet, it's fillet. And we're gonna put a slight fillet on each of these edges because when I go to print them, I'm gonna print these faces flat to the build plate. And that's really gonna give me my best result. So by putting a fillet on it, when the edge is flat to the build plate, it gets what's called elephant foot. It gets a little bit bigger because it's overexposed. And by putting a fillet here, we can compensate for that and still get good fit. So probably like a 0.5 fillet, right? You don't wanna deform it too much and you still wanna have some meat, if you will, in this part of the pin. Let's see, let's go 0.8. 0.8's probably okay. These are gonna be so small, it's gonna be annoying. But hey, and then we'll click on OK. So now what we've done, let me bring back the body. And the reason I did it in that specific order is if we go to look at a cross section of my lure, we'll go this way. When you get to the back, you see that little gap there, right there? That's because when we joined it, we didn't have the fillet on. So it cut out the non-filleted hole, if you will. And then we added the fillet. Filleted. That's ridiculous. Then when we added the fillet, you know, it cut this material out from our pin. So this makes it slightly easier to deal with any variations in the printing, especially on this edge that's going to be against the build plate when we go to print this pin. So you could obviously put them off the build plate and use all kinds of supports, but really I find that to be just a real pain in the rear. It's much easier just to smash them on the build plate and compensate for it with a fillet. All right, let's cancel that. And there we go. So now we have our pins, we can hide them, and we have our holes that the pins are going to go into. Now, you can add another fillet around this edge if you want to. So I'm going to select all of these edges here and add a fillet. And the reason I'm going to do that is we're trying to give ourselves the best chance of having these two things slide together relatively easily, but tightly when we're 3D printing. So a good thing to do once you get your printer set up and printing and your resin really dialed in is you can do a test print of a very simple hole and a pin. I use a 10mm pin and make a 10mm hole, print it out flat on the build plate, and it should slide right in. Now the tricky part comes when you're printing one piece in a different resin and the piece that's going to slide into in yet another resin. We'll talk about that more in detail when we cover the crankbait lips, because I do print those in a different resin than I print my bodies. And we'll talk about how you kind of calculate that and compensate for that. But print these parts and slide them together. You should see that on the bottom you have an elephant's foot, and it should stop it from sliding all the way through. Then you can start adding a fillet on there and see kind of how much of a fillet you need to compensate for the elephant's foot on that particular part. If you want to download my little silly test model, there's a link in the description below. Okay, so we've selected all those edges. We're going to hit fillet, and let's maybe do 0.5 there as well. Again, so we have a relatively small area of these flat surfaces here, but I think that's good. So now what we're going to do is add the pilot holes for my screw eyes. And if you're going to do a through wire, some sort of wire harness, the process is the same from a fusion standpoint. You would just draw the lines that I'm about to draw in whatever kind of path you needed them for your wire harness. You'll see what I mean. Okay, so we're going to do a new sketch. I'm going to click this back face again, and I'm going to use a line tool, and I'm just going to go from the back, and I'm going to put this on a slight angle. I probably should know what this angle is, but I'm just going to wing it. I should also know what length I need. 8mm is probably okay. Now, what we're doing here is basically laying out where our screw eye holes are going to be. So I'll run with one right through the center here, and let's bring one up right here through the belly. Now, obviously you can put these wherever you need to, but that's what I'm sticking to. Now we finish sketch. And I'm going to use the pipe command now to cut out these holes. So I click pipe, and I'm going to click that. And I know I need 1.45. So this is another number that you're going to have to figure out on your own, depending on what screw eyes you're using, what wire you're using, etc. You're going to want to print out a simple block, make a bunch of holes in it of various sizes, see which ones fit your hardware. I know this one works for my resin and the screw eyes I'm using. I can screw them in there. It doesn't blow apart the lure, and I get a nice, good bite. Your number will be different. All right, click OK. Let's bring back the sketch again. Create pipe, same thing. It should save my number. Yep, and one more. Boom. All right, one last thing we're going to do here is collect that edge. I hit the F key for fillet. You can click fillet up there. And let's see, maybe a 1. Nope, it's too much. 0.5, too much. 0.3, 0.4. So I'm going to put a slight fillet on the tail. I'd like it to be a little bit more, but the angles aren't working out. So I'm going to do a 0.3 there, and I'm going to come up front. Now, let me show you a trick here that I hit enter to get out of that fillet command, but you can just come over here and click plus and add this edge and see if you can add a bigger fillet on there. So that's a downside to using more angular sketches there, is the fillets become difficult. Okay, so now I got those edges done. Now comes the exciting part. Now we go to create, mirror. We want to make sure this is on bodies. It'll default to faces. Click that body. Our mirror plane is going to be this plane right here. You could also click this face if you want to. It doesn't really matter. And you'll see it pop into place. And there is our lure body. And we want to make sure we are new body. We don't want to join them together, because we're going to actually print this in 2 parts. If you were going to create a lure that you printed completely in one piece, you could join them at this point. We'll discuss that in a future video. We click OK. And there we go. I have my very basic lure body. If we take a look at the section analysis, we scroll this back, we have our screw eye, pilot hole, we hit the pin, we hit the top hollow part, little belly weight area, the pin, there's our pilot hole. Come on back, we have another pin back here, and then we run into our pilot hole there. And there we go. Okay, so now is a great point to probably print out this lure and see what it looks like in your hand, see how it feels, and see where you want to make adjustments. You want to get all of that out of the way before you spend a lot of time working on details like eyes and gills and fins, because that stuff is very delicate and will break if you start making major changes to the lure body. So we want to get this thing nailed first. So we're going to discuss exactly how I set this up in the 3D printer in a future video after we add the details, but just throw it in there and try to print it however you think makes sense and see how it all fits together. Especially if this is the first time you've made this lure, it'll really, really help you out. If you want to see all the other videos in the series, the playlist is right here. Take care, guys. Tight lines. See you part 4.